Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Mursaleen. Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. I bear witness that no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah Ta'ala, the one who has no partner and no similar, the one who has no length and no width and no depth and no perimeter, the one who's not a volume and is not in a place, and how could he be in a place when he existed before time and space? He created everything except himself, including you and your actions. Nothing occurs except by his will, both good and bad he destined to happen. He speaks without sound, letter, or language, not Arabic, Hebrew, nor Korean. He's not light, he's not a spirit, he has nothing in common with human beings. He's not in the direction of up, down, right, left, front, nor back. And whatever you imagine in your mind, Allah is different than that. And I bear witness that our noble, unrivaled Master, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the slave of Allah, his final messenger, and the best of all of God's creations. May Allah unite us with him in paradise and grant us a drink from his basin. And may Allah increase us in patience, humility, knowledge, and comprehension, and help us to put our knowledge into practice, and grant us all sincere intentions. Ameen. We're continuing today in the book, The Hadrami Introduction, Al-Muqaddimah Al-Hadramiyya, written by the Allama Bafadl Rahimahullah. We've made it in the book to page 21. Page what? Page 21. It says section 2, the book of Salah. I remind you that the word kitab in Arabic, it's very frequently translated as book, but the actual meaning of kitab in Arabic is ad-dammu wal jama'. It's to combine things. Okay, so a book is called kitab in Arabic because it combines all of those words. All those words are combined together to make a book, or perhaps because the pages are combined together. And in the subject of fiqh, this book is a fiqh book. It's an introductory text in Shafi'i fiqh. When they say kitab of salat, what they mean is they're gathering together a lot of Sharia rulings that pertain to salat. So it's a kitab, not because it's a separate book of its own. It's a section of the book. That section of the book combines the rulings pertaining to salat. As for the word salat, the word salat linguistically, meaning in the Arabic language, the word salat means dua. So in the days before Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam began receiving revelation, if a person said the word salat or the word yusalli, it would mean that salat would mean dua, and yusalli would mean someone's making dua. It basically means to plead for something, to beg for something, to ask for something. This is what the word salat means in the Arabic language. However, when the subject of discussion is the Sharia, as is the case in this book, the books of fiqh deal with Sharia, Islamic law. So when the topic of discussion is Sharia, in that case, the word salat has a special meaning, a meaning which is specific to the terminology of fiqh. When fiqh is being discussed, the word salat refers to sayings and movements that normally begin with a takbir accompanied by an intention and normally ends with a taslim. So in the subject of fiqh, when the word salat is used, this is its meaning. This is its literal meaning. When the topic is fiqh, the literal meaning of salat is that set of sayings and movements that normally begins with a takbir and normally ends with a taslim. That thing is what we call, that thing is what the word salat is referring to. So here in this section, we're going to be talking about that thing. We're not going to be talking about dua in this section, even though duas may be mentioned. The topic of this section, the book of Salah, is to talk about the well-known act of worship which begins with a takbir and involves lots of sayings and movements, and it ends with a taslim. It says, the obligation of salah. So the first thing we're going to talk about in the book of salah is we're going to talk about who exactly are the ones obligated to perform salat, because not everyone is obligated to do it. The author, may Allah have mercy on him, said, salah is obligatory on every Muslim, adult, sane, and pure person. Let's go through this word by word. He says salah. We already talked about what the word salat means. He said it's obligatory. What does obligatory mean? Obligatory, in the science of fiqh, the word obligatory refers to an action that you are rewarded for doing, and you are threatened with punishment if you fail to do it. A thing is obligatory if doing it correctly and on time earns you reward, and failing to do it correctly and on time puts you at risk of punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If a thing that meets that basic description, then that thing is obligatory. It's obligatory for you to do it. But when it comes to salat, it's important to note that the obligation of salat, well, there are a couple things to note. The first thing to note is that not all salats are obligatory. In fact, there are only 5 salats which are obligatory, and those 5 salats occur every day. They are Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha, and Subh, which is also called Fajr. Those 5 salats are the only obligatory salats. On Fridays, Jumu'ah takes the place of Dhuhr for the ones who pray Jumu'ah in a valid way. So on Friday, the 5 obligatory salats would be, Jumu'ah for those who pray it in a valid way, or Dhuhr for those who did not pray Jumu'ah in a valid way, and then Asr, Maghrib, Isha, and Subh. Those are the obligatory salats. Any other salat except for those is not obligatory. Second thing, or next point I want to make, is that when it comes to these obligatory salats, the obligation to pray these salats is what we call a wide obligation. Okay? It's wide. What do I mean when we say it's a wide obligation? I mean that the obligation to pray that salat falls on your neck, meaning the obligation to perform it, that responsibility comes upon you at the moment that the salat time comes in. At the moment the salat time comes in, at that moment, you have an obligation to perform your salat. Okay? But because this obligation is a wide obligation, you don't have to perform it at that moment. Okay? The moment that it becomes an obligation upon you is not necessarily like the moment that you have to actually perform the salat. Okay? So at the moment that the salat time comes in, at that moment the obligation falls upon your neck. But you have the freedom, because it's a wide obligation, you have the freedom to delay doing it. Okay, you don't have to do it at that moment when the salat time first comes in. You can wait 5 minutes. You can wait 10 minutes. You can wait 20 minutes. You can wait 45 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours. Okay, you can wait and do it later, on the condition that you have the firm intention in your heart. You've made a resolution in your heart that you will perform it before its time goes out. That's what we mean when we say it has a wide obligation. It means there isn't any specific moment in which you have to do it, but rather there's a specific moment in which the obligation comes upon you, and you're free to delay doing it if you choose to. Okay? But Pay attention here now. But there will be, like, if you keep delaying it, there comes a moment when the obligation shifts from being wide to being specific. When is that moment? It's the last moment in which you can begin the prayer and finish it within its time. Meaning, if you prayed the salat as quickly as you possibly can, you left out anything optional in the salat, you only did the obligatory parts of salat, you did it as fast as you possibly can. Okay, if you pray it as fast as you can, what's the last moment you could start that salat and still complete it within its time? If that moment arrives and you still haven't prayed the salat, well, then at that moment, the obligation shifts from being wide, meaning you can delay if you want, and it becomes specific, meaning you must pray at that exact moment, and you don't have any option to delay anymore. Okay, that's what we mean by a wide obligation. You're free to delay it until the point where you can't delay it anymore. And when it comes to salat, that point at which you can't delay it anymore is the point at which, if you delayed one more moment, you wouldn't complete the salat within its time. Okay, if you delay past that point, it's haram upon you. You have the sin of delaying your salat too much if you delay past that point. Let me say it again. The obligation of salat for these 5 obligatory salats is a wide obligation, meaning that at the moment the salat time comes in, the obligation comes upon you to perform that salat, but you have the freedom to delay it. You don't have to pray it at that moment. You have the freedom to delay your salat as long as you have in your heart the firm intention to perform it within its time. And you can continue delaying it until the point at which, if you delayed it any further, you would not complete it in its time. Okay, so your obligation goes up until that moment at which what remains of the salat time is exactly what's required for you to perform it. Thank you. I'm glad someone asked the question. Someone asked, isn't it sinful to delay the salat 15 minutes after it comes in? No, it is not. According to the Shafi'i madhab, the obligation of salat is a wide obligation. You are not sinful for delaying your salat until you've delayed it so much that you cannot complete it within its time. At that point, you're sinful. As long as you pray before that point, then you've avoided any sin. But this does not mean that the virtue of performing the salat is the same throughout all of that time. You have a wide obligation, which gives you the freedom to delay. But as you'll see later in the chapter, praying earlier in the time is better, more virtuous than praying later in the time. But you're not sinful until that point at which you cannot complete the salat within its time. If you've delayed it that much, that's when you've committed a sin. Let's go back to the sentence. It says, salah is obligatory. We explained that part. On every Muslim. What do we mean by Muslim here? We mean a person who's actually a Muslim. Okay, meaning a person who either was born and raised as a kafir, but they said the shahadas with the intention of entering Islam. Okay, and by doing that, they became a Muslim. Or we mean someone who was born into a Muslim family where at least one of his parents was a Muslim. And then that person grew up and reached puberty. And at the moment that he reached puberty, the belief that he had was consistent with the Islamic belief. That person is a Muslim. This is what we're talking about. Okay, a person who is Muslim, either born Muslim or converted to Islam. So you should understand from that then, that if a person is an original kafir, meaning if someone was born a kafir and they never entered Islam, you should understand, therefore, that that person is not obligated to make salat. Okay? That person does not have an obligation to perform salat in the dunya, although that person, if he dies still in a state of kufr, he will be tortured in the hereafter for failure to make salat. Okay, he will be tortured in the hereafter for not making salat in the dunya. This is why some scholars, they say, because he's tortured for not doing it, this means technically he was obligated to do it. And you'll hear some scholars say that the kafirs are obligated to pray salat, but the nature of the obligation is that their choices are either to accept Islam and then pray, or to be obligated to be punished for not praying after death. Some scholars say it like that. Other scholars just say they're not obligated in the dunya to make salat, but rather to be punished for failure to make salat is obligatory upon them in the hereafter. Both of these are like different expressions for the same concept. Okay, the point is, if a person is a kafir and has never accepted Islam, it's impossible for that person to perform a salat. Okay, because salats are not valid from non-Muslims. If he converts to Islam, well, then he'll be considered a Muslim. And we just said here, Muslims are obligated to pray. Okay, and as you know, if a kafir becomes Muslim, all of the sins, if an original kafir becomes Muslim, all of the sins they did prior to that are forgiven. So any of the missed salats that he missed, if we say they were obligatory upon him to do in this dunya, they would all be forgiven, and he would not need to make them up. And if we say he wasn't obligated to pray them, then still he wouldn't make them up. So the important thing to understand here is that if a person was born kafir and converted to Islam, he does not make up the salats that he missed prior to entering Islam. Okay, he does not make up the salats that he missed prior to accepting Islam. And if that kafir never accepts Islam, if he was born a kafir, lived his whole life as a kafir, and died as a kafir, then he will be tortured in the hereafter for his failure to perform the salat. Let's go back to the sentence. He says, salah is obligatory on every Muslim adult. The next word he says is adult. What he means by that is pubescent. Okay, if a Muslim reaches puberty, then at that point, Islamically, he's considered to be an adult. Even though we in the West don't frequently consider a person an adult at that age, because puberty might hit at as young as 9 years old. We in America don't typically use the word adult for people very young, but Islamically, once a person hits puberty, they're an adult, and all of the obligations of the deen fall upon their neck. Okay, what exactly do we mean that a person is pubescent? How do you know if a person is pubescent or not? Well, there's different ways. We'll start with boys. For boys, there's two ways to know if he has reached puberty. The first way is if semen comes out from his body. If he releases semen, then that means he is pubescent and is now Islamically an adult. The second way to know if a boy has become pubescent is if he reaches 15 lunar years of age. Okay, so even if he never released any semen, once he completes 15 lunar years of age, he's considered pubescent. He's considered an adult Islamically, even if he never released any semen. As for girls, there are three ways to know if a girl has reached puberty. The first way is if she releases her version of semen. Okay, women, in English, we don't call it semen, but the truth is women have a fluid that they release if they achieve their sexual pleasure. And if a girl releases this fluid, then she's said to be pubescent. The other way that you can know if a girl is pubescent is if she has her first menstruation. And the third way that you can know if a girl has reached puberty is if she reaches 15 lunar years of age. Okay, it's not true that all of these signs have to happen. Any one of these signs is enough. So if a woman never released her version of semen and never had a period, but she completed 15 lunar years of age, that by itself is enough for us to say she's now pubescent. And then therefore the obligation of salat is upon her neck. It says salah is obligatory on every Muslim, adult, sane, and pure person. What do we mean by sane? By sane, we mean that the person's not crazy. They haven't lost their mind. Okay, a person is sane as long as they still know what they're saying and doing. Sometimes a person loses their mind. They go insane. They start saying things and they don't realize what they're saying. They start doing things and they don't even realize what they're doing because their mind is gone. These people are insane. An insane person is not obligated to make salat. But if your mind is still present, then as long as you're also a Muslim and pubescent and a pure person, then you are obligated to make salat. What do we mean by a pure person? Pure here, I'm going to point you to the note. My copy has a little 48 written there with a footnote at the bottom of the page. I'm going to coach you how to change this footnote so it's more correct. It should say, free of either preventing impurity. Free of either, or if you prefer either, free of either preventing impurity. Get rid of that comma and put a colon there. Scratch out the word like. And then the rest of it is okay. So that footnote should say, free of either preventing impurity, menstruation or postnatal bleeding. So when we say salah is obligatory on every Muslim adult, sane, and pure person, we mean anybody who's a Muslim and pubescent and sane and not currently menstruating or postpartum bleeding. If that's true for you, if all four of those are true, you're Muslim and you're pubescent and you're sane, and at the moment you're not menstruating or postpartum bleeding, then that means salat is an obligation upon you. The 5 daily salats are an obligation upon you. That's what it means by pure here. It means not menstruating and not postnatal bleeding. That's what it means. Some person might read that and think it means that if you don't have wudu, then salat's not an obligation on you. No, that's not what it means by pure here. Okay, if you don't have wudu, salat is still an obligation upon you. It just means you have to make wudu first and then pray. But the salat remains an obligation upon you if you need wudu. However, if you're having menstruation, then it's impossible for you to make salat. In fact, you're obligated to not make salat while you're menstruating or postpartum bleeding. I'm going to read the footnote again because someone asked. Footnote number 48, I changed it so that it says, free of either preventing impurity. So I scratched out any and replaced the word any with either. Free of either preventing impurity. Then I scratched out the comma that's there, and I put a colon in its place. And I scratched out the word like, so that the footnote will read, free of either preventing impurity, menstruation, or postnatal bleeding. The way the footnote is written, he makes it seem like there's also more possibilities besides menstruation and postnatal bleeding, and there are no other possibilities. Those are the only two. Okay, those are the only two that the word pure is meant to exclude. Okay. Next sentence. Man, that was a long sentence, huh? It says, there's no obligation to make up the salah on the disbeliever. What does that mean? We mean if the person was born a kafir and grew up a kafir, and then they accepted Islam, they said the shahadas to become a Muslim, then they do not have to make up all of the salats they missed before accepting Islam. Okay? That's what we mean when we say salat is not an obligation upon the kafir. We already mentioned, of course, that if the kafir went their whole life as a kafir and died as a kafir, then they do get punished in the hereafter for not making salat. He says, unlike the apostate. Unlike the apostate. So the apostate, what's an apostate? An apostate is someone who was a Muslim at one point in their life, but then they left Islam. Okay, they left Islam either willingly or perhaps unwillingly. Some people leave Islam by mistake because they don't know the things that take you out of Islam, and they do one of those things without realizing that they left Islam. This can happen. If a person leaves Islam, whether knowingly or unknowingly, they become an apostate. An apostate is a kafir, but he's not treated the same as an original kafir. Okay, there's a difference. Kafirs are of two types. There's original kafirs and there's apostates. An original kafir was born a kafir and lived his whole and has been a kafir, like whatever age he is when you're talking to him, his entire life up until that point he was a kafir. This person is called an original kafir. Okay, he was born a kafir and has never been anything other than a kafir. That's an original kafir. For that person, when he accepts Islam, he does not need to make up all of the salats he missed while he was a kafir. But an apostate is someone who was a Muslim and he left Islam. Let's say this person left Islam. He was out of Islam for like 2 years, and then he came back to Islam. The apostate does have to make up all the salats he missed while he was out of Islam. Okay, the salats he missed for those 2 years that he was an apostate, he needs to make them all up. That's why it says here, there is no obligation to make up the salah on the disbeliever, meaning the original kafir, unlike the apostate, meaning the kafir who is not original, the one who had been a Muslim at some point. The apostate does make up his salats. Nor on the child meaning someone who has not yet reached puberty. So if a kid was 7 or 8 years old and they missed a salat, they would not have to make it up, not right away while they're a child. And even after they become an adult, even after they hit puberty, they do not have to make up any salats that they missed prior to puberty. Then it says the menstruating woman or the woman with postnatal bleeding. Okay, the menstruating woman also does not make up the salats that she missed while she was menstruating. And the woman with postnatal bleeding does not make up the salats she missed while she was experiencing her postpartum bleeding. In the case of the menstruating woman and the postnatal bleeding woman, not only does she not make up these salats, it's haram for her to make up those salats. She's forbidden to make up the salats that she missed while she was either menstruating or postnatal bleeding. This is because her obligation during those salat times, her obligation which Allah put on her, which she must obey, is that she must skip those salats. Okay, while she's having her menstruation, she is obligated to not pray. And so once her bleeding is over, and now that she's able to pray, she doesn't pray the ones that she missed. No, she was commanded to not pray those. You understand? So it's haram for her to pray those salats once her bleeding ends. The author, may Allah have mercy on him, continues. He says, nor on the insane. So if a person went insane, like they lost their sanity, their mind went away to the point where they don't know what they're saying and doing, Okay, this person does not make up the salats that he missed while he was insane. So say he was insane for a week, he doesn't make up the salats he missed during that week. It says here, except the apostate. Okay, unless it was an apostate who went insane. In that case, he still makes up those salats. So again, let's go back to the example of the person who was a Muslim and he left Islam, and 2 years later he came back to Islam. This person who was out of Islam for 2 years, he has to make up all of the salats he missed for those 2 years. Even if he went insane, say he went crazy for 3 months during those 2 years, he was insane for 3 months. He has to make up the prayers he missed during those 3 months also. Okay, even though the general rule is salats you miss while you're insane, you don't need to make them up. In his case, he still makes them up because he's an apostate. And the rules on apostates are more harsh than the rules upon everyone else. The author continues, may Allah have mercy on him. It says, and neither the unconscious, so there's also another type of person who doesn't make up the salats that he missed. That's the person who's unconscious. We mean like someone in a coma. Say someone fainted, they passed out, or they went into a coma, something like that. If a person's unconscious and missed some salats, like say someone fainted and didn't wake up till 2 days later, or say someone went into a coma and they were in a coma for 6 months. Okay, these people, when they, arise from their situation, when they wake up from the fainting or the coma, they don't make up the salats that they missed. Okay, it says, unless, there's one case where they will have to make them up, unless he has become intoxicated, having transgressed with drinking. What does that mean? You mean if the only reason why the person passed out is because they intentionally consumed something that would make them pass out. Okay, like a person was drinking alcohol until he passed out from it. He did it on purpose. He knowingly drank alcohol on purpose, and he passed out from it. In this case, he still makes up the salats he missed while he was passed out. Okay, because it's his own fault. He knew he was drinking alcohol, and he drank it anyway. And just like I said for alcohol, it would be true if it were some other drug. Okay, if a person took a pill and he knew the pill would make him lose consciousness, that he'd faint, he'd pass out for a day. So he took the pill just to avoid salat, for example. Yeah, well, guess what? He has to make up those salats because he made himself pass out on purpose. Anyone who purposefully takes something to make him lose consciousness, that person makes up the salats that he missed while he was out of consciousness. And yes, it's also true that if a person fainted while they were in apostate, he also needs to make up those things. Or if he went into a coma while he was an apostate, he makes up the salats he missed while he was unconscious. Again, that's just because he's an apostate and the rules are more harsh on apostates. Are there any questions about this paragraph? This paragraph is super important. Someone asks, in Shafi'i fiqh, should a person not offer sunnah prayers if they owe fard salat? For example, even tarawih. Okay. So first thing I would say before I answer this is it's better if you don't use words like should when you ask a fiqh question. Okay, the purpose of fiqh is not to respond with what you should or shouldn't do. Fiqh responds with one of 7 answers. Okay, if whatever your question is, the fiqh answer will either be that thing is obligatory, or that it's haram, or that it's sunnah, or that it's makruh, or that it's mubah, like neutral, or in some cases, you might get an answer that it's valid or invalid. Like should and shouldn't are not fiqh answers. So if you're asking should they or shouldn't they, then it's almost like you're not asking a fiqh question. As for the ruling of making up a fard salat is that it's obligatory to make up a fard salat. And then the next question is, what's the nature of that obligation? Is it a wide obligation or is it a specific obligation? We were talking earlier today that sometimes an obligation is wide, meaning you're allowed to delay it. And sometimes the obligation is specific, meaning you can't delay it. The answer is, if you missed the salat, all right, if you missed the salat without a religiously valid excuse, okay, you didn't have any valid excuse for missing that salat, in that case, your obligation to make it up is a specific obligation. You must make it up at your very first opportunity. You're not allowed to delay it. To delay it would be another sin. So if the salats that you missed were missed without a religious obligation, you must make up the fard that you missed, and which means you don't have time to pray any sunnahs. If you prayed a sunnah, then that means you're sinful for delaying an obligation that you're not allowed to delay. However, if the salat that you missed, if you missed it with a valid excuse, okay, if you missed it with a valid excuse, like say, for example, you overslept, you prayed Isha, you went to sleep, and you slept through your alarm and everything. When you woke up in the morning, the sun was already up. You completely missed subh time. Being asleep is a religiously valid excuse. So if you missed the salat with a religiously valid excuse, then in that case, you have an obligation to make up that salat, but the obligation is wide. So you can delay it if you want to. In fact, you have all the way until death to make up that salat. You just have to make it up before you die. And so when it comes to praying tarawih and sunnah salats and things like that, as long as the salats you need to make up were missed with a valid excuse, then it is permissible to pray the sunnah salats and make up the fard salats later. It's permissible to do that. However, very few scholars would recommend that. The majority of scholars say, and I'm sure most everyone would agree, the majority of scholars say that because the obligatory things are more important, you should always give precedence to that which is more important. So you should make up your missed fard salats, even if it means you didn't do sunnah salats. And this is wisdom, because if you die without having prayed those missed fard salats, you're going to be punished for it. But if you die without praying sunnah salats, you will not be punished for it. So which one is more important? Which one takes precedence? This is why some of the scholars, they have an expression in Arabic. They say, Man shaghalahu al-fardu an al-nafli fahuwa ma'adhur. Okay, this rhymes in Arabic. He says, whoever, it was his case that fulfilling obligations kept him busy and stopped him from doing optional things, this person is excused. Then it continues, وَمَنْ شَغَلَهُ النَّفْلُ عَنِ الْفَرْضِ فَهُوَ مَغْرُورٌ. It says, and whoever allowed optional things to busy him and prevent him from doing the obligatory things, this person is deceived. Okay, so, don't be among those who are deceived. Fulfill your obligations first and do the sunnahs later. Furthermore, inshallah, they'll mention it later in the book. I don't recall right now if they say it in this book, but if not, I can always tell you myself later. The sunnah salats are of different ranks. Some are higher rank than others. And although we love Ramadan and we love Taraweeh a lot, the Taraweeh Salat does not have the high status that many of the other Sunnah Salats have. Like the 2 rak'ahs you pray before and after Dhuhr are of higher merit than Taraweeh. So imagine the 2 rak'ahs before Subh, which are even higher still. Or imagine Witr, which is even higher still. Or imagine like the Eid Salat, which is even higher still. In the list of optional Salats, Taraweeh, it's not near the top of the list, mashallah. So for sure, it's better to pray your obligatory Salats instead of Taraweeh. And you don't have to let praying the obligatory Salats keep you away from the community. If you owe obligatory Salats during Ramadan, go to the masjid. Go there while they're praying Taraweeh. Pray your obligatory Salats. Okay, you don't join into the same Jama'ah, but like pray yours while they're praying Taraweeh. And if they're giving lessons or things like that, at least you're there for it. If they're talking and having iftar, at least you're there with them. It doesn't have to be a reason to separate yourself from the community. It just means you are handling your business. Next paragraph. Oh boy. All right, this one might be a little bit long and it might push me a little bit over the normal time, but I'm going to start it. This next paragraph deals with what do you do if something happens to make it so that now you can't make salat. And I'm not talking about if you break wudu. I mean, like, what if your period starts? Or what if you lose sanity? Okay? For example, or what if you were a child and suddenly became an adult? Okay, what's the rule if you had one of these things, you were in one of these states where you can't make salat, and then you finally recovered from that state? Which salats are you obligated to pray? This is what we're going to talk about here. The author, may Allah have mercy on him, says, there is an obligation on the one who has authority. Actually, we didn't get to that topic just yet. So there's like a sentence before we get to that topic. He says, there's an obligation on the one who has authority and the master. When we say the one who has authority, we mean the guardian. Right? The one who has authority, we're talking about like the parent of a child, or if the child is not with their parent, whoever the guardian of the child is, whether it be like a grandparent or an uncle or a foster parent or whatever, some adult is put in charge of a child. That adult is called the authority. That's what it's referring to here. It says, and the master, which means if someone is a slave, that slave has an owner. The owner of the slave is called a master. So he's saying here, the guardian of a child and the master of a slave have an obligation to do what? To order the differentiating child to perform it, meaning to perform salat, when 7 years old. So if you are an adult who's the guardian of a child, once that child reaches 7 years old, 7 lunar years of age, you have to order that child to pray the 5 obligatory prayers. And when I say order him, I mean order him like really order him. Don't just say words, make the child understand that this is something he has to do, that he doesn't have a choice about. Okay, get that child to understand the importance of the salat so that he never leaves it out. Okay, once they're 7 years old, that's what you do, as long as they're mentally discriminating, which is usually the case by age 7. And the same is true if this child is a slave. If you're the owner of the slave, you have a religious obligation to order that child to perform the 5 obligatory salats on their times. Okay? If the guardian or the master fails to do this, the guardian and the master are the ones that are sinful for not commanding the child. The child is not sinful for not praying. It's the guardian and the slave who are sinful for not commanding him to pray. And if you command him and you see that he didn't pray, you keep commanding him until he does it. You don't say, well, I commanded him, so I did my part. No, you let that child understand it's unacceptable for the child to fail to perform the salat. He says, and to admonish him for it when 10. What does that mean? When he says admonish, he's looking for a soft word. But what the Prophet ﷺ said was hit him. Okay, the Prophet ﷺ said, order children to pray when they're 7 and hit them when they don't do it once they're 10. So once a child is 10 years old, you now have a religious obligation to hit them if they fail to pray on time. To do what? To hit them for failure to pray on time. And even though it doesn't mention it here because we're in the book of Salat, these same rules apply also to fasting. So when the child is 7 years old, you order him to begin fasting in Ramadan. And if they're 10 years old, you hit them if they don't fast in Ramadan. Okay, this of course is assuming they're able to bear fasting, which is usually the case. Usually they are able to fast even at age 7. Our children are capable of much more than most of us give them credit for. Let's keep reading. He says, when the child becomes an adult. Okay, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about a case where somebody was not obligated to make salat because they had not hit puberty, but then they hit puberty. That's the case we're talking about. Someone was not under an obligation to make salat, and then suddenly they were obligated. It says, or the insane or unconscious wake up. This is another case. Somebody was insane, which means they weren't obligated to make salat, and then they recovered from the insanity. So now suddenly they're obligated. Or someone was in a coma, and they wake up. When they were in the coma, they weren't obligated to make salat. Now suddenly, now that they woke up, suddenly they're obligated to make salat. We're talking about cases where somebody was unable to make salat and was not obligated to do it. And then suddenly the obligation comes upon them. What's the rule? It says, or the disbeliever becomes Muslim. Okay, imagine somebody had been born a kafir, grew up his whole life as a kafir, and now he takes shahada. Okay, well, prior to taking shahada, he was someone that wasn't able to make a salat. Now the obligation of salat is upon him. Or the menstruating woman. The book here left out part of the text. The translator skipped some words here. It should say, or the menstruating or postnatal bleeding woman becomes clean. You need to add in here, or postnatal bleeding. It should say, or the menstruating or postnatal bleeding woman becomes clean. Because this is another example where someone was not obligated to perform the salat, and then suddenly, boom, something happened. Now the obligation is on them. Okay, in this example, a woman was on her period, and then her period stopped. Boom, now she's obligated to make salat. Or she had postpartum bleeding, and it stopped. Boom, now she's obligated to make salat. These are all different scenarios of the same thing, where someone was not obligated to make salat, and then whatever it was that kept them from being obligated to make salat suddenly ended. And now the obligation falls upon them. What is the rule? It says this change happened where they became obligated to make salat happened what? Before the exit of the time. So we're imagining, for example, someone who took shahada during Asr time. Okay, it wasn't sunset yet. Maghrib didn't come in yet. It's Asr time when he took his shahada. So he suddenly became a Muslim during Asr time, like before Asr time went out. Okay, or her bleeding ended during Asr time. Or the boy, had a wet dream during Isha time. Or the person in the coma woke up during Subh time. Okay, the thing that was making it so they're not obligated to make a salat, it went away in the middle of a salat time. This is what we're talking about here. Okay, as long as there was still some time left before that salat time went out, they're obligated to pray that salat. It says here, even if it is enough for a takbirah. Okay, even if the only amount of time remaining in the salat time, it was only a few seconds. It was just enough time for him to say Allahu Akbar, and then the time went out. This person said his shahadas, and there was enough time to say Allahu Akbar before the next salat time came in. Then guess what? He became obligated to pray a salat while that salat time was in. Doesn't matter that there was only enough time left to say Allahu Akbar. He has to pray that salat, the salat whose time was in when he said his shahada. Whatever salat whose time was in when the woman's period ended. Whichever salat was in when the postpartum bleeding ended. Whichever salat was in when the child became pubescent. Okay, these things, whichever one was in when the status switched from not being obligated to being obligated, that salat has to be prayed. Even if you're not able to pray it in its time, you have an obligation to pray that salat. It says here, then, to make up salat is obligatory. So in all these cases, if any of these things happen, child becomes an adult, insane person wakes up, unconscious person wakes up, kafir becomes Muslim, menstruating woman stops menstruating, postpartum bleeding woman stops postpartum bleeding. If it happened during a salat time, before that salat time ended, then it's an obligation to make up that particular salat whose time was in when the status changed. It says, on condition that the absence of the preventing factors is continuing enough for that person to perform purification and salat. What does that mean? It means you have to make up that salat if this thing that was stopping you from being obligated to make salat, if this thing went away long enough for you to perform your purification and perform that salat. So let's talk through it. If the child became pubescent during Asr time, and there was just enough time to say Allahu Akbar before Asr went out. Well, we ask ourselves, now that he's an adult, is he going to be an adult long enough for him to make a ghusl and perform Asr? If he's going to, be an adult that long, then yes, he has to make up that Asr salat. Why? Because he became pubescent during Asr time. That's why. If the menstruating woman, if her period ended during Asr time, and there was enough time to say Allahu Akbar after her bleeding stopped and before Asr ended, then that means if her period stays away long enough for her to make a ghusl and pray Asr, then that means she needs to do so. She needs to make up that Asr. You get the idea? Okay, we're saying, like, maybe you'll understand it better if we talk about the insane person, because insanity is something that can come and go quickly. All right? Status as an adult is not going to change. The interval between periods is something that will last at least 15 days. But insanity, a person might be insane and might recover from insanity, and 5 minutes later might be insane again. Like sanity can come and go. So imagine someone, they were insane. And during Asr time, suddenly their sanity came back. They woke up. They were lucid. Okay? They became lucid during Asr time. All right? There was still enough time left in Asr to say Allahu Akbar. Maybe more time than that, but there was at least enough time to say Allahu Akbar. Then what that means is this insane person has to pray Asr. He's obligated to pray Asr. Okay? But his obligation to pray this Asr prayer, it will only be there if his sanity lasted long enough for him to go make a ghusl and pray Asr. I'm not saying that he has to make a ghusl and pray Asr. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, was he sane long enough that he could do whichever purification is required and perform Asr? Usually when a person goes insane, when they come back, they need to make a ghusl. That's why I said make a ghusl. But if it's the case that he only needs to make a wudu, well, then we ask ourselves, was he sane long enough to make wudu and pray Asr? If the answer is yes, then he needs to pray that prayer. Even if he then loses sanity again, I feel like I'm being more confusing here. Let's use real times. Let's say a person was insane, recovered, his sanity came back with 1 minute left in Asr time, which is more than enough time to say Allahu Akbar. Matter of fact, let's just say with 5 seconds left in Asr time, his sanity returned. So he's sane now. But maybe the first thing he thinks isn't, oh my God, what salat time is in? Oh my God, do I have to pray salat? Maybe the first thing he thinks is, what happened? Where am I? Last thing he remembers, he wasn't even in this place because he's been insane. He hasn't known what he's been doing. He wakes up, he's looking around trying to understand what happened. He's like, where am I? Why are you here? What are these clothes? Somebody explain what's going on. And so they explain to you that you went insane and you've been insane for 7 months, and they say all of these things. Okay? They say all of these things. And let's say they spent, 15 minutes explaining to you what happened to you. And then after explaining to you for 15 minutes what happened, they say, you know what, it's Maghrib time, we got to go pray. And when they say it's Maghrib time, we got to go pray, now the insane person thinks, oh, yeah, salat. You suddenly reminded about salat. And he now knows he needs to make salat. But just when he remembered he needs to make salat, he went insane again. This person did not make ghusl. He did not make any salat. Okay? Our question is he responsible for praying that Asr salat? The answer is yes. Why? Because his sanity returned with enough time left in Asr to say Allahu Akbar. And he remained lucid for a period of time. In this case, he was lucid for 15 minutes. 15 minutes is long enough for him to make a ghusl and pray Asr. So he was lucid for an amount of time sufficient for him to do whatever purification is required for him and to pray Asr, like a quick Asr. He had enough time to do that. So therefore, he is obligated to perform that salat before he dies. Okay? In this case, he missed it with an excuse. He had an excuse because he went insane. He has a religiously valid excuse. And so, although he is obligated to make up that salat, his obligation is a wide obligation. He doesn't have to do it the minute his sanity returns, but someone needs to inform him that that Asr salat is among the salats he does have to make up. And in fact, in this scenario I just gave, he would also have to make up the Maghrib Salat, because he was lucid during Maghrib time long enough for him to have prayed Maghrib as well. MashaAllah, it's late. I've been talking a lot. I think I'm going to just, next week, inshallah, I'm going to start with this topic over again from the top. This topic is extremely important, especially for you sisters out there, because this is going to happen to you every month. Every month your period is going to start, it's going to last for a while, and it's going to end. And you need to know, out of all the salats you missed while you were on your period, which ones do you have to make up and which ones can you not make up? All right, we're starting the discussion with which salat time was in when your period ended. You're going to know from that, you know, one or two salats from the end of your period might need to be made up. And then we're going to switch and talk about, well, what salat time was in when your period started, because you might need to make up a salat from the beginning as well. We're going to talk through all of that next week, inshallah. I'll start over from the beginning. Maybe I'll find a way to say it more clearly. Are there any other questions before we sign out? Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, for anyone who slammed me. Okay. Well, I've responded to the questions in the class, so let's say La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. بارك الله فيكم. I'll see you next week, inshallah ta'ala, at the normal time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.